Right, Second Chronicles chapter 34, let's call this one Candor or Candid and subtitle it Purge, as we look at Josiah take over the kingdom of Judah at 8 years of age. And at the ripe age of 16, it's going to say that he dedicates himself to actually seeking out God seriously, I'm going to add to what's written here. And then by the time he's roughly 20 years of age, he is going to begin to purge the land of all the residuals of the idolatry that came before him, both under Ammon, his father, and any residuals that were left from Manasseh or any of the kings who had strayed before him. And so after a 6-year purge, he is going to now have the nation in position to begin to repair the temple. And it's kind of shocking that it takes that long just to clean up the land from 2 years of Ammon and whatever was left over from Manasseh, just so that they can get to the point where they can finally rebuild the temple effectively. But at the point they begin to rebuild the temple, they are going to discover something that I just assumed they had the whole time. And since this is a retelling of the version that we saw in the Kings, we already know, if you've seen that one, that they're going to discover the book of the law, which begged the question, how are they going about accomplishing Passover in the days of Hezekiah and even accomplishing all the things that Josiah had accomplished to this point if they didn't even have the book of the law? And that goes back maybe in some ways to the mercy that Hezekiah prayed for as they were reassembling as Judah and the pieces of the nation of Israel that were willing to join them in restoring the Passover and their relationship with God. God gave them mercy or pardon in that situation. And likewise, this is another example of how in approaching God or trying to restore or repair our relationships, we don't have to be perfect if we are candidly or genuinely trying to restore the relationships, understanding that God knows our hearts and he can likewise expose our ulterior motives to the people with whom we are trying to restore relationship. And so in this circumstance, the fact that Josiah is not only candid about trying to restore the nation, but he's willing to make the changes that are necessary once he sees how far they are, even in their best intentions, from who God had called them to be once they get the book of the law and they read it and they see just how much of a fail they kind of still are, even though God is blessing their good intentions. And so Josiah is not going to be satisfied with good intentions. He is going to cry out to God to forgive the difference between what they are and what they should be. And God is going to respond to that prayer by the word of Huldah, a prophetess, who's going to say, it's too late for the nation of Judah. The damage is irreparable. However, because Josiah has responded in what the chapter is going to describe as a tender heart, and he has actually listened to the things that God is saying they still need to do to get to where they need to be, it's going to say that God has heard him. God is going to respond by carving out a final era of peace under Josiah's leadership before the nation goes into its final decline. But a few things stood out to me from this chapter, not the least of which was the way in which it described Josiah getting serious about seeking God. It's specifically going to use a term that's kind of a throwback to the days of David, where it says he leaned neither to the left or to the right in his pursuit of God. And that seemed to jump off the page to me in an era where it is so tempting to try to mix God with a leaning to either the right or the left. And I'm making no bones about correlating that to our political leanings to the right or to the left. And why is that important? Well, because as we mentioned, Josiah is going to go on to spend roughly 6 years purging the land of its tendency to try to mix God with idols that essentially tempted them to lean either to the right or to the left, whatever their preference was. Understanding that we don't have to have the same set of preferences they were confronted with to fall into the very same temptation they fell into. And that is to try to mix God with clever wisdom that basically just waters down his counsel. And so Josiah, reaching back to the example that he really had in David in establishing the nation in righteousness, leaning neither to the right or to the left, really goes back to the founding of the nation in general that we saw under Joshua, as we saw him confronted with the captain of the Lord's army, asking him, are you for us or for them? To which, as we've mentioned before, the captain of the Lord's army says, no, I'm carrying out what God has told me to do. And to the degree you're on the same page, I got you. However, the captain of the Lord's army did not lean towards Israel or any other nation. David, in his righteousness, established Israel as a nation that did not lean either to the right or to the left. And now Josiah is establishing the last remaining piece for Judah by leaning neither to the right or to the left. And that may be the point that stood out to me most from this chapter, because it reminded me of Jesus' warning that you cannot serve two masters. He talks about it from the perspective of God and money. And most commonly today, I seem to see believers stretch between at least three, one being work, the other being some form of on or offline social network, and with any leftover time trying to get a grip on who God really is, and maybe just as importantly, who he has called us to be, making it super easy for many, if not most, to fall into the trap of using that little bit of residual time they have left to lop off pieces of God's counsel and fit it into a space where they're spending most of their time, and that is having their self-esteem, their identity, and all the other parts of who they are informed by their social network. Understanding that Josiah escaped that trap by purging himself of any distractions either to the right or to the left and shifting the amount of time he could have focused on distractions to truly understanding who God was and who he had called him to be. A trap that he is likewise going to be able to lead Judah out of, but for only a generation, as his descendants lead Judah back into a mix between God and clever perspectives that result in Judah's final decline.